want to start today by reading a poem. This poem is written by a young Black Jewish poet by the name of Aaron Levy Samuels, and it comes from his book, Yarmulkes and Fitted Caps, which was published a few years ago. The poem is called Special Delivery, the Blackest Jewish Kid Ever, and it goes like this. It is the last 5 minutes of Hebrew school dance class. Your teacher shuts off the 1937 version of Ushafta Mayim B'Sasson, gives the nod of approval to Benjamin Zipperstein. He turns up the best possible dance track, Special Delivery, off Bad Boys, We Invented the Remix. And you are no longer the sticky-haired nerd boy trapped in Hebrew school in Edgewood. You are the half-black, half-Jewish love child of Usher and Michael Jackson. That's what your middle school friends told you. That's where you learn the secret formula to anything and everything cool. Melanin, the most badass chemical on the planet. That's where you learned. When an octopus is being attacked by a predator, it launches a cloud of liquid melanin into the ocean as it escapes. True story. And you know the truth of this story, just as you know the black liquid running currents through your shaking body the moment you are commanded to dance. This is when you show all your Jewish friends that your blackness is a bag of Orville Redenbachers and the dance floor, the microwave. Last time your corduroy split right down the middle, but this time you're ready. You got your 100% polyester gray and white Adidas swishies, got your P. Diddy battle track, got your yarmulke and your fitted cap. Both match your sneakers. And you are an octopus. Music pulls your body in 8 directions, and your friends want you to dance so bad they don't realize they have become the sharks. Their white teeth clapping to the beat, and you dig from inside your gut and launch a smoke cloud of blackness into the synagogue. And suddenly everything you do is the blackest dance move possible. The sideways karate chop? Black. The life-size soup bowl? Black. They ask you if you can crip walk, you say yes. They ask you if you can Harlem shake, you say yes. They ask you if you can do a windmill, then pivot quickly to a headspin pop, and you say yes, because you are that black. While everyone else burns, you just get blacker. Black is the new Jewish, and Jewish is the new black, and you are the blackest Jewish kid in Edgewood. Now, I can't read it as well as Aaron does. I would highly recommend Googling it and watching him perform at a spoken word event that poem. But why I wanted to begin there is because when I think of the theme of today's Global Day of Jewish Learning, Kavod HaBriot, human dignity, that poem was the first thing that came to me. Now, I know to many of you, you're wondering why I would begin with a poem about being Black and Jewish. And so I'll begin by sharing a little bit about myself. My father is Black, the child of parents from the Bahamas. He grew up in New York as a young Black man. He met my mother, a Toronto Ashkenazi Jew, and together they moved back to Toronto, where they started a family, and they had me and my younger brother. Now, we grew up in Toronto in a very racially diverse community. There were mixed-race kids all around me my whole life, but there weren't so many Jewish kids. That said, my Jewish life, my Jewish identity, my Jewish culture were always very strong. Every Saturday, my grandparents, my mother's parents, would pick us up, and they would take us for dinner. We often went to dinner at places that were sort of hot spots of Toronto's Jewish community. I don't remember so much outside of the interactions with my grandparents, but my mother tells a story of a day that we were together at a dairy restaurant that is very popular in Toronto. And as we walked by the table, my grandfather heard somebody say under his breath, "Adopted." Now, of course, there are many adopted children in our Jewish community. But this woman was making an assumption as to how me and my brother, whose skin is darker than mine, came to be part of our Jewish community, came to be my grandparents' grandchildren. For her, there was no way that children who were born to Jewish parents could be mixed race. My grandfather, as the story goes, turned to her, and he was a fairly brash person, and said, "No way. These kids aren't adopted, they're my grandkids," because he knew exactly what she had said. When I think about my life growing up, I often wonder what it would have been like for us had we been in more formal Jewish contexts. We weren't. Our Jewish life was very much centered on our immediate family. So my mother, my uncle, my grandparents. We were very strongly culturally Jewish. I'm named after my grandmother's oldest sister, her Yiddish name that she did not even use here in Canada. My brother's name is Asher. And for us, our Jewish identities and our Black identities, our mixed race identities, were always very fully who we are. But I didn't have community. I had friends. I had a community that was where I lived, of the people who were sort of culturally similar in various different ways. I was a musician. I had a music community, but I most certainly did not have a Jewish community. And it was something I wanted. My mother tells me often, we joke, that she doesn't know where this came from. But from the time I was very, very young, I desperately wanted to know more about Judaism and Jewish identity. Now, I'm often grateful that my mother and my grandparents shielded me so that the stories I hear of the way that my brother and I might have been received by the Jewish community were all told to me much later in my life, when I already was very secure in my identity and in my Jewishness. I wonder what it would have been like, though, if I had the Jewish community that I've formed now as a child. My community now are people of all racial backgrounds. I have many friends who are Black and Jewish, and we share experiences like what Aaron speaks about in that poem. Now, what he's really speaking about in that poem is feeling at home with his Jewish friends, but also performing another identity that they had exoticized, right? He's there. They're egging him on to show something cool, and that something cool is his Blackness. Now, that's not an experience that I particularly had. However, it's an experience that is highly relatable, as I hear things like, well, what do Black Jews think about? Or, can you help us find Black Jews for our board? Now, this is the adult version, but it's very much a similar form of tokenization, representing or being asked to represent a culture that, yes, it is yours. However, you're being asked to sort of put yourself out there in that way. Now, I speak often about being mixed race and being Black and being white and being a mixed race person who can walk into a synagogue looking like the vast majority of the white-skinned Jews there and never being questioned. However, what I will say is that doesn't come without a feeling of feeling out of place. You often hear about people, Black Jews in particular, but Jews of color, walking into Jewish communal spaces and at best seeing nobody who looks like them, and at worst being questioned about their presence. And I think of the fact that I walk in, I'm never questioned. However, I never see anyone who looks like me. And I say that kind of laughingly, because on the one hand, yes, of course, I see white-skinned people with curly brown hair and glasses. It's a real joke. But I don't see anyone who I can identify as sharing the other side of my racial identity. Now, when I think about our community, and I think about what it's meant to me over the last number of years to develop a community of people with whom I can share not just my Jewish experience, but my Black experience, I think very deeply of that idea of dignity. I think about what it means to show up in spaces as your whole self, not pick and choose which part of your identity fits into a given place. And I think about the things and the years of my life where I didn't have Jewish community either, where amongst my other mixed race friends, that was something that did not necessarily fit. And I think very much also of the Jewish communities that I've chosen that have really strived to live by values of tikkun olam, of repairing the world. And have strived to be warm and inclusive and welcoming, and also have done wonderful advocacy work on issues that touch the Black community. And I think often about how at high levels of our community, people show up for racial justice. But I also think about the fact that estimates put the number of Jews of color anywhere from 7 to 15%. And yet I walk into spaces and I don't see it. And I think often about what does it mean when kavod habriot, human dignity, of the Jews of color in our community means that we're very often not there. And what I mean by this is, when I speak to my friends, when I speak to my colleagues, and I hear that they've been questioned when they walk into spaces that they have every right to inhabit, that for them, sometimes entering into Jewish spaces means that they have to accept that they will be seen as other. I also think of what it means for our community to often talk about race and racial justice as if it's something that happens outside of the Jewish world. Now, of course, that's not true. There are so many of us who are deeply impacted on a personal level by racial injustice. And I think about what it means when, at the same time that we're having these deep conversations, we're still asking Black Jews who walk into communal spaces what they're doing there. Or we're asking them to perform their Blackness. I think about this often, and I think about this more and more the more I do this work. And I think about, and I'm grateful to, my parents all the time for equipping me with the ability to be entirely me. To recognize that I am always both Black and Jewish. And that when I walk into spaces, I walk in both of those identities. And that now that I'm a Jewish communal professional, that the lens that I bring to that work is always impacted by feeling outside. I'm as inside as an insider in our community could possibly be. And yet I constantly feel slightly out of sorts. The last number of months have been really hard. We're living in a global pandemic that none of us really know how to navigate. But also we're dealing with a new reckoning on race. And I live in Toronto. We're talking about it here too. And it's really struck me how this is playing out inside our community. I've been really privileged to be invited to speak over and over and over again to people inside the Jewish community. And the biggest thing that I try to leave people with is a sense of gratitude for having been invited, but a sense of disappointment that it took how many in-your-face instances of racial injustice to get here. I've been speaking openly about race and racism inside our Jewish community for years, but it's really only this summer that people have started to listen. Another thing that really strikes me is, and again, turning back to our theme of kavod habriot, human dignity, that really what I think propelled us here was seeing the dignity of a man stripped away in just such a raw form when we saw George Floyd, may his memory be for a revolution, calling for his mother. I think about that all the time, that it was that moment of humanity that all of us could relate to as people, as parents, as children. Seeing a man lose his life in that way has been what has propelled our community to say, enough, it's time to listen. But I still feel anxious about what that listening means. Does that listening mean that we will show up until we find another social justice cause? Does that listening mean we will read books about race and racism, but take very little action? Does that listening mean that we will look and see race and racism outside of our Jewish community, but not take the difficult inward look to see how it's impacting people and how our own community has complicity in that? These are the things that keep me up at night, truthfully. And so when I think about this, and I speak really from the heart today, when I think about what does it mean to show up, what does it mean to see that glimmer of God in everybody's eyes? Now, before I became a professional, I was a graduate student in Jewish philosophy. And I think often about the idea of the face of another person, that face of another person is where godliness lives. And for me, when I think today of what I hope to bring and what I hope that everyone who I have an opportunity to teach and to learn from, because education in my mind is always a dialogue, it's that giving human dignity is something that we give each other in every moment that we recognize it. Our dignity is not guaranteed. And our dignity especially is not guaranteed when we are other. That's a lot. That's a very emotional thing for me to say. But when I think about my biggest hope is that now that we're having this conversation, we think about what we can do to ensure that every person who wants to be part of our community is met with dignity. And when I say wants, I mean belongs inside our community. I think about my grandparents. I think about them a lot. My grandfather's been gone 8.5 years now. My grandmother, 4.5. And I think about my parents, fortunately, both still with us. and with long lives ahead. And I think about the lesson that they taught me, the number one lesson, that I am always fully me. And I think about what does that mean in our community. And I'm grateful. What I want to leave you with is a question. What does human dignity mean to you? How can you ensure that people, whether it's Black people outside of our community or Black Jews, mixed race Jews, other Jews of color within our community, feel that you see their human dignity? If there's one thing that we can all commit to, it's at the very least that. Thank you so much for listening to my talk. I'm happy to connect with any of you anytime to discuss further. And thank you to Limud for having me today. I hope you enjoy the rest of the sessions that you attend.